Hi, everybody. This is Cindy Kennedy, and you are listening to another episode of Living with Lyme. We are very, very excited to have Kris Newby with us today. And if you don't know her name, I'm sure you know about her documentary that she was the senior producer on, and that is Under Our Skin. She is with us to talk about her book called Bitten, and which it in fact, won a Silver Nautilus Award in journalism and in investigative reporting. And, you know, if you have never understood or read about theories about where Lyme actually came from, she's going to be here today to talk to us more about her investigations and, you know, leading to the truth of where it all came from. So I welcome you, Kris. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, thanks for the invitation, and thanks for everything you do for Lyme patients, because I know it's really isolating when you're sick at home.
It's awful. It's awful. And, you know, it's funny because when I was in the deepest throes of it, Dr. Cameron, who I saw, had said, it must be terrible at night when it's dark and quiet. And I was like, yeah, when you can't sleep, because about 100% of the people with Lyme just have some sleep disorder because it interferes totally with your adrenal glands. And yeah, it's quiet and dark, and every day's like Groundhog Day. You think maybe tomorrow I'll feel better, and that next day was just like the last day. And then some days were even worse. So yeah, so I'm dying to hear, where did your interest in Lyme disease actually come from?
Well, in 2002, my family went to Martha's Vineyard off Boston and for a family vacation. And we came back to California, and a week later, my husband and I were sicker than we'd ever been before. We just sat in bed and looked at each other on a Sunday night. It was like, we can't go to work tomorrow. And so we went to the doctors, and they said, oh, it just looks like you have a virus. Just come back in a week or so. But we came back in less than a week because we just felt so sick. I mean, the worst flu-like symptoms, a lot like COVID, you know, just every muscle hurts. You're so weak and tired. You can't get out of bed, horrible headache, night sweats, fevers. And so we went back.
Oh, we lost you there.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
There we are. Come back. Come back. Stay with us.
Okay. It says my internet connection is unstable. Oh no.
Well, I got you here. And you said you had gone back to the doctors.
Yeah, and so that going back and forth, and they're saying, you know, and I'm an engineer, so I kept really meticulous notes on when my symptoms showed up. My husband and I basically got sick on the same day, and we had the same symptoms. And every doctor I saw, I would say, well, I think it could be Lyme, because I know that's a huge problem on Martha's Vineyard. I mean, there's signs everywhere, tick warnings. We did tick checks every day, but didn't see a tick. And so this goes on for, I mean, a year, 10 doctors, and $60,000 in medical expenses.
For the two of you, you were both simultaneously sick like that for the same amount of time.
Yeah, and we had 2 middle school boys. About mid-year, I mean, we were bitten in August. About mid-year, I couldn't work anymore. My husband went into work because we needed the health insurance, and you can't get, you know, time off for illness if you can't define the illness. So it was just really frustrating that year of not being diagnosed. And finally, and every doctor I asked, it could be Lyme, will you test for Lyme? No, that's a rare disease. And it would be like winning the lottery for you both to get it, you know. And finally, I went to the large, you know, academic center near my house, and they test, you know, they're one of the high dollar specialist infectious disease people. And they tested every, you know, like 10 things, including syphilis and AIDS. And they finally tested for Lyme, and the first Lyme ELISA test came back positive. And they weren't going to show us the test, but then I said, but what about that Lyme ELISA? Because I was curious, the symptoms seemed to fit. And he says, oh yeah, that was positive for you, but that's a really unreliable test. So I'm not going to believe it. So then I thought, oh, great. I still don't know what's wrong with us. I go home and I read on the CDC site, oh, if you have a positive Lyme ELISA, you need to go to the next step to the Western blot. So I call them up and they said, oh yeah, we thought they would just order that immediately, and so I went in and I got
liar, pants on fire.
I know. And then I came back with another positive ELISA, and then they fired us as patients. So they said, we don't have the tools to treat people like you, implying that either we were crazy or they thought we were crazy, or because the last doctor had said we had a psychosomatic couples thing. But we were so disabled by them. It was like having multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's and chronic fatigue and arthritis all at the same time, and GI, irritable bowel syndrome. It's like, how can a couple get sick on the same day and have all those systemic changes and test positive for Lyme and not, so that was like my interest in Lyme disease, mostly to save my family and understand, like, I'm a curious science writer and engineer. I just want to know, why is what we're experiencing and what other patients are on Lyme so different than what, the ivory tower infectious disease doctors say it is. And so that's, as soon as I was well, we found a good experienced doctor in Lyme disease in our town, which is lucky. And, the minute she saw my symptom chart, I was like, oh yeah, you have Lyme disease. I mean, stop, don't tell me any more symptoms. Let's just test you.
Yeah.
Her test came back positive multiple times. We started on sort of the regular protocol for Lyme disease, which is figure out if you have co-infections, because those take different drugs, and start slowly with antibiotics, because you don't want to have a die-off that will kill you from sepsis.
Yeah.
And then, so, my husband at that point was better in about 6 months. I was still really sick after 6 months of treatment because I had undiagnosed babesia, and that requires antimalarials. So once I started treating that, it was like a miracle. I was a human being again. And so during that process, I started doing research. I said, people, if you read the literature, you're not going to understand what's happening. I'm going to start a documentary, because then we can interview the patients, and then they'll see these aren't hypochondriacs, people who enjoy being sick. These are normal people who were hit by a lightning bolt with this disease. So I started doing research, and I ran into another filmmaker in Marin who was doing the same thing. So we joined forces.
Yeah. It was so eye-opening. I had a patient in my GYN practice that was basically, completely it was in a wheelchair. Let's put it to you that way. So, that she was not able to work. She wasn't able to take care of herself. She needed full-time help. And she finally got to a doctor who's no longer practicing at the Cape. He's an older gentleman, but he was really proficient in this disease treatment. And she actually handed me your documentary. And because at that time I was still trying to figure out what was wrong with me, because I was being passed off multiple times, because on paper, I was great. My whole body was doing great, but there was something going on underneath. And it wasn't until a little bit later, either just after the diagnosis, that I actually watched it. And it's been a long time since I've watched it, but my biggest memory was that woman poolside who was walking like she had Parkinson's or ALS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that was Mandy. Yeah.
Yeah, that was crazy. That was crazy. So for people who don't know this documentary, tell us a little bit about it and tell us where they can watch it.
Okay, so it's available on Amazon Prime for free if you have a subscription, or you can order the DVD from, just do Lyme documentary or Under Our Skin, and you'll get to the website and order the DVD. But what Andy Wilson is the very talented director who was the head of that project, and I was support in research and general fundraising and keeping the project going. And what we did was we sort of put out a call in the Lyme community and say, do you have an interesting Lyme story? And so I would say our first trip was to a Reston, Virginia Lyme conference, and we holed up in a conference room and we announced in front of the crowd on the first day, tell us your Lyme story. So we had, we had 60 patients in 2 days, and we filmed their stories. And at the end of it, we were crying. I mean, because they were all equally tragic, but they were all the same story, people being abandoned. And that was the first time we said, well, we have a really good story that no one's told before. So then what we did is we chose like representative patients. There was one with like Mandy with this sort of ALS kind of movement disorders. And then there was like a young girl, high school girl who was a ballerina, and then she just had crushing fatigue and couldn't even walk anymore. And then we had Dana, who was a roadie for the U2 band, and she was just sort of like a lot of Lyme people, she was just on the verge of not being able to work at all, but somehow she just kept going at it, the denial that you're sick and you really need to take care of it, but you don't know what to do next. And then we had Jordan Fisher, who's a park ranger. So he's just like this big, robust guy, super strong. And he's just completely felled by the disease. It breaks up his marriage, like so many people with Lyme disease, because it's hard for the spouse to understand how you can look so good, but you're really sick. So anyways, we showed that. And then we broke it up like in a regular Hollywood movie in a 3-act structure. So, there's the people who are misdiagnosed. And then the second act is they find a doctor. And then the third one is their recovery. So, and so it was, it was received really well for a disease film, because who wants to watch an hour and a half of people suffering? But, I think it was just eye-opening. The company is called Open Eye Pictures. To see that for patients, they really appreciated it because it helped them explain to their family what was going on, and that they weren't, and the patients themselves, it felt like, oh, I'm not alone. There are other people who've experienced this. I don't have just some freak situation.
Right. Because after a while, when people aren't believing you, you start thinking you are crazy. And, all of the emotional and, crazy stuff that goes through your head, you're really isolated, and the family not understanding, and, it's very, very difficult. And many people that I have spoken with, that their relationships with family, with friends, with their spouse, it couldn't hold on. My husband, Joe, and I have spoken at conferences surviving Lyme disease as a couple, and really telling our story to try to help people who really need this information, that it's, my husband really puts it out there that he finally realized, and he needed some help on the outside, but that it wasn't me he should be upset with. He should be upset with the disease, because that's what was causing all the problems. And again, once you've been sick and it's so complicated and things just slowly improve, and sometimes they don't improve, and and either it's the problem of who's treating them, that they're just keeping them on that same path. Oh yeah, it's going to happen. They're not thinking outside the box. Is there something else going on? Like mold illness. Mold illness is like crazy. That really, really inhibits the people's ability to get better. And, it's a fight. Even though I'm in Massachusetts and we're pretty endemic here, we've got it everywhere, and, certainly all the way up north, but doctors are still in denial. They think it's a bacteria, kind of like what you get when you get a pneumonia, and you just treat it with antibiotics and boom, boom, it's gone. But what I find is so infuriating is that if you take a person who you're treating for, we'll go back to the pneumonia, and you treat them for whatever the time period it would be, 12, 14 days, they're better, but they're not quite all better. No one has a problem writing a prescription for at least another week. You know what I mean? And what happens with Lyme people is, and this is exactly what happened with me. It's vivid in my mind, the fight I had with my primary care. who basically said, there's nothing more I can do for you except give you 21 days of doxycycline. And I'm like, bring it on, bring it on. And then she sent me to a rheumatologist, and I was just finished the 3 weeks. I go, I am 75% better. And the answer I got was, well, I don't know why. Now, if I'm 75% better and I was treated, wouldn't you think, just like you would with pneumonia, let's try to give more, you know? Anyway, so
Right.
that's pretty much the battle that I, led to try to get diagnosed and all. So the big thing is Dr. Willie Brooksdorffer. I always want to call him Brooksdorfer, but I got to remember that that's not him.
Yeah, everyone called him Willie because Bergdorfer is just a mouthful.
It is. You have to be very prepared and make sure you enunciate that. But listen, this is the man. I want to know how you found him, how you interviewed him, and kind of all of this story. We got to get into this because this is crazy.
Well, when I started my Lyme journey, Willie Brooksdorffer was the hero because he was the NIH scientist who, Polly Murray in Lyme, Connecticut was the first to start documenting all these Lyme cases. And he was the guy who came in after all the other specialists failed to find out what was making these people sick and said, this is it. So we all worshiped him. He's great. And so when we were doing the documentary, we wanted to make it fair and balanced, not just the patient side, but this is Andy. We both found that none of the public officials or scientists would talk to us. It was like too politically hot to handle. We didn't know why they wouldn't talk to us. So we're getting to the end of the 3 years of filming, and we said we need to get the other side, the experts. So we knew that Willie was in Montana, and he was retired. So he wasn't under the thumb of the PR people of the agency. So we flew out there, and we were setting up the sound and lights, and about 45 minutes into it, there was a knock on a door, and it was one of the scientists at Rocky Mountain says, I've been asked to sit on this interview. And shocking because it was like Willie had a minder. The director was really angry and said, no, he's a private individual and we should be able to interview him without a minder there. And so he left. Everybody was mad and tense. And so then, including Willie, was upset. So we did a long interview with him, and at the very end, and he told us things that were shocking. He said, like, NIH knows Lyme disease can be chronic, especially harmful to the developing neurological systems of children. And we hadn't heard that yet, and it wasn't in print anywhere. So that was like a big get, we thought. But after we turned off the camera, Willie had this little smile. He says, I didn't tell you everything. So we knew there was more there, but we had to get the film out. And we released it at Tribeca. But Willie was also said that he felt like the science was corrupt, which was shocking from him too, to say that. So we got the film out, and it ended up winning 20 documentary awards, and it was an Oscar semifinalist, which was amazing. And we felt like it did a lot of good. I still get good feedback, but I was over with Lyme, because I had gotten well finally after the film. I went on IV, and I felt like I was beyond it, and I haven't relapsed, and I got a really good job as a science writer at Stanford. And so I was done with Lyme, and then a documentary friend of mine was inspired by the film, and he went out and interviewed Willie and got Willie to say that he thought that the germ, the outbreak in Lyme, Connecticut was caused by a biological weapon. So, he sent me that documentary, and I said, I have to see it. I have to see it to believe it. And I watched it, and it was just like, I went outside like this. It's like, oh my gosh. There were rumors of it, but to hear it from Willie's face. So what he's saying is, he's a very credible witness. He's saying, my whole discovery was based on a lie. I withheld this really important information that I felt like this outbreak was caused by a biological weapon. He didn't give any details, but it was enough for me to say, well, I could walk away from this. This is sort of a dangerous story, especially if I'm a science writer at the university, but I have to know, I have to know if it's true or not. And so that started a 5-year journey that ended up with Bitten. And so, what happened from there is Willie's personal papers that he gave to NIH had just been posted at the National Archives in Maryland. So the filmmaker and I went there and we just spent a couple days digging into them. And the interesting thing is there was nothing about the biological weapons program that he implied that he belonged to. And there was nothing about Lyme disease in those files. It was 33 boxes of files. So it's like, what happened to the Lyme stuff? Why are the notes of his biggest discovery of his career in there? And there was this thing called Swiss agent in there, which had never been identified in the literature that I had seen. So then I went out to see Willie, and that's where that was six months later. And that's where the big sort of shocker was. I videotaped it where Willie said, yes, I was in the biological weapons program for 20 years. And I was hired to put plague and fleas, so those could be dropped on our enemies, mass-produced mosquitoes, so we could put diseases in them and drop them on our enemies. And there were also papers of him with ticks, stuffing them with pipettes, putting dangerous diseases in the ticks to see if they could be turned into weapons. So that would be like rabies in ticks, which is a really fatal disease, spotted fever in ticks, Venezuelan equine encephalitis in ticks, leptospirosis in ticks. So that was sort of when I knew I really had a story, and then, the research went on.
So were the papers that went to Maryland or to DC? Where did you say they ended up?
They're in National Archive in University of Maryland.
Oh, okay.
Right outside of DC.
Did they pull out all of his information on Lyme disease?
So I'm not sure. I asked the archivist when I got there, like, where are the Lyme, has anybody looked at these before? He said, no one's looked at these. You're the first people to look at them. There is no way, once the files came to us from the NIH, that, there's a clear chain of evidence. So he doesn't feel like anybody, once they got to the archives, things weren't taken out. So the question is, did NIH take it out? But what happened later is that it turned out Willie had copies of his biological warfare documents that he had kept in his garage. So I didn't know that at the time. And so I went and interviewed him, and I got some details, but I couldn't find anything online that confirmed his work in the biological weapons program. So then what happened, which is just dumb luck, is Willie, after the 2 visits by the journalist, decided, well, maybe I should release these secret biological warfare experiments. So he called up Ron Lindorf, who is an adjunct professor at BYU, and said, hey, I heard you work for BYU. They have a historical files archive. I want you to take these very historic biological weapons documents and put them in an archive for everyone to see. Because I guess he was afraid that they would be censored. And so Ron knew I was working on Willie Brooksdorffer's biography through the Lyme network, and he called me up. I didn't know him, and he said, would you like to look at these before they go into the archive? Because the archive process can take years. And so I went there, and that's where we found this little brown folder, that brown that they used to use in the 50s for government files. And on top of that file was a yellow sticky that says, I always wondered why someone didn't do something. And then I realized I'm that somebody. So it was sort of like a confession, a confession. And inside that was all his Dietrich work. So, the plague and fleas, he tried to weaponize Colorado tick fever virus. He was helping with a vaccine on that too. So, I'll just back up because, I get into the history and I don't back up and say how it made me feel, that our US government was creating chronically disabling germs that were carried in insects and dropping them on our enemies and doing a bunch of open air experiments around the United States with no controls or consenting the people who live in those states. So it was pretty shocking. And at that point, I had to keep it really quiet, and to have a husband who was relapsing. And so I couldn't, to hear the similarities of the scientists in the military describing the effects of these diseases and how they make monkeys sick, and then think, oh, my family's just a monkey, and all these Lyme patients are monkeys in the interest of the military. So, it was sobering.
I understand that. And okay, but why has it held every kind of the nook and cranny of learning? And okay, so this all happened. People can feel like they can trust, the information, or they don't care to learn or even identify that could be a problem. But why has it led to so much misinformation, misguidance, and untreatment, of Lyme disease?
Well, the politics of the disease have sort of gotten out of control, just like in our government right now. And it's really complicated. It's not one thing. So one thing I did in the book was, it's like, the thing that's freaky about these, there was 3 tick-borne diseases that showed up at the end of the 60s. It wasn't just Lyme. There was a spotted fever rickettsia, and there was babesiosis, and they were just very unusual infections. Babesiosis, that was the second case in humans recorded in the US. And then the spotted fever was strange in that it wouldn't test positive against any of our known strains. And then, of course, the Lyme disease, Willie Brooksdorffer, which hadn't been identified yet, it was creating this crazy sort of arthritis. So what I did was, okay, Willie supposedly discovered it in 81, the Lyme disease. And, that was like confetti and champagne popping. Oh, the sickness is done. But this, as we know, the sickness keeps on going. So what I did is I worked backwards from 81, and I looked at, okay, what were the outbreaks in newspaper archives, and where were the animal die-offs, and what's the paper trail of the public health people when this first started showing up in the 60s? And so from that, I pieced together that this really looks like an unnatural outbreak, because if you look at the biosecurity people that study, okay, are we being attacked, by a foreign national, the clues were all there. This one paper has 8 clues that I have in the book, and one is it a point source outbreak? Yes, these 3 tick-borne diseases started around, Long Island, in Connecticut, in New York, in New Jersey, started there, and then Wisconsin. Pretty unusual. Was it an unusual disease? Yeah, no one had ever seen this kind of set of symptoms before. The crazy puffy knees, the bullseye rash, and then high mortality and sickness. Yeah. So, it all supports to an unnatural outbreak. And what Willie said is, if you look at the big findings that I present in the book, a lot of it is just the history of the biological weapons program. So that this wasn't even the craziest experiment they did during the Cold War, but it was that, Willie was doing all these mix and match with diseases and insects. He said that when he analyzed the blood of Steer's patients, he had like 20 or so samples, he said every one of them had this strange rickettsia that was making people sick in the early 70s. And not even all of them had spirochetes in them. So, and he was told to sort of sweep under the rug this other rickettsial. And why that's important, it's like spotted fever, is that spotted fever was an active bioweapons program. And so the government at that time was trying to mass produce ricketsials, freeze dry the spores, and then aerosolize them so they could be sprayed over the enemy. And so anyways, and then the other thing the book found is during my research, there was a witness who said he worked for the CIA during Cold War in '62, and he said he dropped poison ticks on Cuban sugar workers as part of the Operation Mongoose, to get rid of Fidel Castro. So the point is, this program was as secret as the Manhattan Project. They got top scientists from Germany and Japan to work at Dietrich. That's what funded Willie to come over from Switzerland to work on these experiments. And there were accidents along the way. And so
this is the good part. I want to, it's one thing to say you did this in a science lab, but then how did it get so populated? How did it get out? How did, it's obviously it wasn't intended to hurt us.
Right. So in the process for going from an idea for a weapon to deploying it in the field, it's complicated, multiple steps. So the way it worked with tick-borne diseases is Dietrich was a headquarter in Maryland, Fort Detrick, and they would have an idea. They'd say, okay, Willie, we need a really deadly tick that won't draw attention if we drop it in Cuba, or if we drop it in Vietnam, or if we drop it in the Soviet Union. So they would give him an assignment, find us a tick and a disease, and he would do trial and error, and he would send some of the samples of the diseases inside the ticks that would work to Dietrich. And then Dietrich would do small pilot programs. Well, how can we mass produce the ticks and these germs? And some were inside insects, and then they decided that's not very practical, and then they moved to only germs, tick-borne diseases outside of ticks. And so they would do pilot programs, and then you have to test it in real-world conditions if you're going to deploy it in the field, because you want to make sure it's reliable. So then Dietrich would design pilot programs and go to Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah, which is about 50 miles as the crow flies from Salt Lake City. And then they would test it in open air. So for example, they had this Operation Big Itch, and they had uninfected fleas in little bomblets, in cluster bombs. And they had a plane fly over a test field with guinea pigs in a circle, and they released the bomb, 50 bomblets exploded at a certain altitude and rained ticks down on the Utah floor. And then little men in white bunny suits would go out and take the guinea pigs in, the lab and pull off fleas, and said, they dropped about 500,000 fleas out of the bomblets. And they said this experiment was a success because we pulled hundreds off the guinea pigs. So the rest of the hundreds of thousands of fleas hopped off onto the desert floor. So I'm saying that's sort of an accident. The one I find most appalling is the experiments with Lone Star ticks near Norfolk, Virginia. So a researcher at Old Dominion University had a Army contract where he released over 100,000 Lone Star ticks in this grid over about 4 or 5 years. And he would put 1,000, he would get gravid ticks, that means females that were about to lay 2,000 or so eggs, inject them with a radioactive fluid. And then all the nymphs that came out of the female would be radioactive for life. That's a quote from a scientific paper. Then he would put 1,000 ticks in each grid in this large field. And then every month he would go out in each grid, he would collect the ticks, take it back to the lab, use a Geiger counter to see how far the ticks released in that grid had traveled in the last month. And he would do that for a year or whatever. So why is this appalling? Well, he just kept on releasing these ticks, and they're radioactive. And as everyone knows, radioactivity forces mutations. So when the germs from nature got into these ticks, did that force mutations in whatever germs got into them? The other thing is Lone Stars, as we're finding out now, super aggressive, man-biting ticks. They give people this red meat allergy that sends people to the ER when they eat a burger or a ham sandwich. And a lot of people have it for life. So Lone Stars, before this set of experiments in the late 60s, were all in the south of the Mason-Dixon line. A year or two after these experiments, Lone Stars were native on Long Island, which they became established. They were pushing out the native deer tick, and Lone Stars carry rickettsias like spotted fever. So, my thing is the Lone Star infestation in Massachusetts and Long Island. That's when the spotted fever deaths spiked. I think that epidemiologists who track disease should consider this, instead of saying, oh, it's just climate change or deer. When you release radioactive ticks on the Atlantic bird flyway, it takes 5 days for a bird to get from Norfolk, Virginia to Long Island. And that should be a factor in its spread.
So how did we end up with deers being infected?
Well, deers have always been part of the cycle of ticks, and humans are sort of collateral damage. The typical deer tick, the little nymphs will feed on mice or little things low to the ground, and then drop off and molt, and then their second or third molting, depending on the species, they overwinter on deers, and that's where a lot of ticks mate on deers. And so that's part of the spread too. Climate change, because winters don't kill off these human experiments that really just dysregulated our ecosystem.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. My husband has a friend who's a hunter, and he was mentioning something about ticks, and he says, oh, you should see these pelts when we, and I don't even want to talk about it because I'm a Bambi lover. I would die. I guess I would become a vegetarian, but thousands and thousands and thousands. I grew up in Massachusetts. I don't ever recall a tick. I played in the woods all the time. I don't remember anything. And now where I live in Western Massachusetts, these things being so tiny are petrifying people. I'm lucky I have a yellow dog, but you're either on the fence of you're afraid and you're really very, very scrupulous about checking your body or your kids, etc., or you're absolutely oblivious to the fact. And, I don't know. There are some people that just don't get sick, and I'm thrilled for them. But the people who are getting sick and trying to get the help and trying to educate, sometimes people are more educated than their own healthcare providers. And if the healthcare providers are completely closed off to this, you get stuck, and then people don't have places to go. Here in Western Mass, there really isn't. You go to infectious disease, honest to God, the stories, we could do a whole documentary on stupid stories of what people have come and told me about, oh no, that was a scab. Oh no, that's just cellulitis, all kinds of crazy things. But the point being is that there's limited care in this area. And what's even worse is there's limited care outside the antibiotic range. There's not, I'm fortunate, I've been taught by a naturopath how to use certain herbal supports, and there's great companies out there that put it all together for you. So I'm fortunate that way, but it's sad because people are walking around not well and don't know what to do about it. And, they go to, if they do their investigation, they go to the CDC, and the CDC finally has, acknowledged the level of infections that are really, and they're probably underestimating by far because there's so many people undiagnosed that are really sick. And then they look at, the length of antibiotic treatment, and then insurance companies, there's a whole side of that with insurance companies denying care. Nope, you can't have more than, 28 days of antibiotics. Oh no, you can't have, all this stuff. And it seems senseless. Okay, let's get beyond all of the political, scientific hogwash that has happened. We can't do anything about the past, but let's identify what we can do, how we can get better testing, how we can get better treatments, put some money into this. When we had Ebola or something, there was all this money they poured into it. With Lyme disease, there's very little funding to help, teach people, bring it to the forefront so people can understand it and help people. You're supposed to, as a medical practitioner, do no harm. Well, being ignorant to me is doing a lot of harm. Ooh, I'm getting on a soapbox. I'm sorry.
No, I've been in this sort of trying to find out what's going on with Lyme disease for almost 15 years now. And it's really puzzling why the scientists who publish the most are digging in about Lyme disease not being persistent. I mean, we found it's persistent in primates, and why wouldn't it be in humans? And I'm doing a project now where I'm analyzing where the government grant money is going for Lyme research. And I was doing it yesterday, and it was just like, it made me sick to my stomach. It's all these people trying to prove it's an autoimmune disease and very little treatment studies. I mean, a drop in the bucket for treatment. So we have like 3 to 5 million people with chronic Lyme disease, I think right now, according to the CDC, and we're just throwing them under the bus. Oh, we're going to work on vaccines that might be ready in 5 or 6 years. But what about the people who are sick now? And then insurance is just doing what insurance does. If you file for expensive IV antibiotics, or you treat with antibiotics outside of the infectious diseases guidelines, reject, saves the money. There's been, up until recently, there have been no repercussions to rejecting it. And when you're sick, oh my gosh, I remember with all the insurance claims paperwork, I couldn't process it. My brain was not working. I didn't have the energy. I was fighting the disease. I really didn't have the energy to fight the insurance companies.
I think people aren't getting well. This is a little bit different take on it. Maybe you can think a little bit about it, but I think the level of toxicity in our air, our water, in our food has left people with this smoldering issues in their body. And that's why people, I think, get more sick. You get all this collateral damage, inflammation, etc. And our pathways for detoxification are just not working really, really well. I'm waiting for some lab results regarding Lyme disease. We've done some for a patient of mine. He's got horrible neuromuscular symptoms, and all of the standard tests, we've tried to use just insurance as best as we could, have come back negative. And, we can talk about that. That's a big debate, whether it's sensitive and specific, and we know it's not. So we're waiting on that. But this poor man, what has happened to him is his occupation is highly toxic, and the air he breathes, what has been on his skin, etc., really has, I think, made him very polluted, and the inability for him to get rid of all of these toxins. You carry this burden. It's a toxic load, and our government in that respect is not doing anything to help us. We don't have the cleanest food. And they don't care. We don't have the cleanest products for skin care. There's no mandate. I think the last time there was any looking at in terms of what cosmetics and healthcare or skin and whatever, it was like in the 50s. No one's really looking at that. No one's looking at it's all this. Okay, how do you treat the problem instead of how to prevent the problem in the first place? So that's one of the craziest things about being in this country. In Europe, the standards are so much higher for the food. That whole farm to table thing is a big deal.
Yeah, they call it the precautionary principle there, that as a cosmetic manufacturer or a supplement manufacturer, you have to prove it's harmless. Here, you don't have to prove it's harmless. you just wait till some people get sick, and then the lawyers step in, and, when enough people are harmed that there's a class action suit, then then they'll fix it maybe. But I mean, you look at Roundup,
Oh, I know.
stuff like that. But I agree, we have pesticides, we have proliferation of plastics, which have hormonal disruptors that disrupt your immune system on some level. Mold, that the government is sort of in denial with. But another thing in my book that I wanted to bring up is that I feel like when Willie discovered Lyme disease in 81, the scientists cheered and the government cheered. Oh, 2 to 4 weeks of doxycycline will cure it. That problem is done. But what my book points out is that there are many co-infections that can worsen a Lyme infection, and we're not even looking for most of the co-infections now. Some of them were weaponized, the co-infections, and I believe some got out of the lab, just like maybe Wuhan, we don't know. But you have really small intracellular bacterium like rickettsias, that spotted fever, and Bartonella, which is in the rickettsia family, and there's just not a lot of research on them. We couldn't really study them until recently, because we need better microscopes, better stains, more sensitive tests. So we're just ignoring that part of the problem. And I worry that a lot of money is going into the Lyme vaccine, but a Lyme vaccine might do more harm than good, because
It's been there before, right?
Yeah, deja vu all over again. But it might do more harm than good, because it gives you a false sense of security of going in the woods, because the ticks also have many other deadly germs like Powassan virus, Bourbon virus, the ricketsias, Bartonella, which I believe that we'll find out that Bartonella problems are much wider than we realize, because they're hiding out in our cats.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate. And my concern now, while we're dealing with COVID, is that people are taking to the outside, taking to the woods, taking to hiking, because that's where we're safer, is outdoor with fresh air. And so I'm waiting to hear what happens. It's just my fear that people are going to be, and then you can't get care. That's the other thing. That's the crazy thing, because you can't be seen in the office. And what happens if you have this spiking, raging fever, and you're so sick and you want to go to the ER? Well, they're turning people away. Oh God, this is it can get crazy. So I'm waiting to see over the next maybe 3 to 6 months if we're going to end up, especially, from the fall, if there's been more issues, come springtime when people really get outside, we'll see, time will tell. I think, Kris, that in light of everything that you have learned, there's got to be some great positives, for more people to be educated and to understand that somebody has taken the time to research this. This is not just nilly-willy kind of guesswork. This is solid, evidence-based information. And, I guess for what I'm trying to have people understand, you can get pretty angry about this, but I don't want people to take that this information and become so angry about it. It is something that is important to understand. There's lots of things that are going on governmentally that we don't know about, and it's very secret. And this is really a very unfortunate thing that has happened, and the injury to people and the sustained illness is really, really awful. But people need to be aware. They need to be aware of this disease. They need to be aware of needing to be tested for co-infections. They need to know that general hospital labs may not have the best tests, that they may need to spend money out of pocket to get some more definitive testing. And it's important because you can't just sit back and say nothing and do nothing and accept the illness. You have to work with people, find people, network with people in terms of how to get the help that you need. And so this has been a huge positive, I think, Kris, because people, people who don't educate themselves, people who just would rather just turn their head or bury their head in the sand, they're not going to be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I always tell people is you have to be your own advocate, and don't try to change the mind of a physician who's been indoctrinated in what is probably false information. Find someone else, because you have to find some with this disease. It's not like 2 weeks of antibiotics will cure it. You need to have like someone who will be your champion through the whole process, because it's a multi-systemic set of diseases, and you're going to need to go to a bunch of specialists and make sure the medications don't clash, and there has to be that naturopath detoxifying component too that I know you espouse, and it's absolutely essential. Otherwise you'll end up with these collateral infection, or like C. difficile.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And you know what? People show up with underlying gut issues that either they've had some symptoms or maybe not so much, or some people have horrific symptoms. And, that's where our bulk of our immune system is. Well, is there anything else, anything that you feel people need to hear outside of what you just said, which is so important? Is there anything that you feel that people need to understand, or tell me, is there anything we've left out?
I mean, the thing I always tell people is that since the Lyme tests aren't that reliable in the first month, if you pull off a tick, send it in to an agency to test what's in the tick. I mean, if there's one message I want people to leave with in the book is, if you're not getting better and you have freaky symptoms and Lyme test is positive, or you're not getting better after the regular Lyme treatment, is look at the co-infections. If you send the tick in, like Pennsylvania has an amazing test set up where Pennsylvania will test it for free if you're a Pennsylvania citizen, or it's a small charge, and they will sequence it for all the nasty bugs that are the germs that are delivered by ticks. So that's faster and cheaper than the human tests. So do that. It'll give, if they're negative, gives you peace of mind. It's less than a dinner out. And then the other thing is, like I said, find a champion with experience in tick-borne diseases. Because if you had a weird, freaky, specialized brain tumor, you would go to someone who had successfully treated that many times. Time is of the essence with this disease. Once it gets entrenched, it's much harder to get rid of. So that's what I say. But with the book, I mean, at the end, I can't answer all the questions. Scientists need to answer all the questions. So it's a call to action for epidemiologists. I know you used to think it was climate change and deer population that was causing this, but there's this other factor. There's this other vector, which were military people in planes and ships who were spraying these live germs that can be carried by ticks. So use that as another factor that has made this epidemic so much worse. And already, since the book came out, I know that more research is going into rickettsial diseases, which is what Willie Brooksdorffer implied was the bioweapon, a rickettsia that is unidentified, which he called Swiss agent, which is ironic because he may be a Swiss agent. But anyways, so those are the main messages, I think.
Oh, this has been really, really great. Very enlightening. You're doing a great job because you're kind of that go-between. You're giving that history. There's so much to learn in history. And, we shouldn't be afraid. We should just be proactive. And I want to thank you for taking the time and talking with me.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for the invitation. And I would tell people, you'll get better if you keep at it. And it's not a straight line. Sometimes it's a roller coaster, but you can get better if you find the right person and just are patient, I would say. And then hopefully research will catch up.
I hope so too. I hope so too. Well, for everybody, we have been talking with Kris Newby, and we've been talking all about her book Bitten, which is available on Amazon for sure. And come back, listen to more episodes. We're really excited to bring you all this great information. If you need any more information about your health and learning more about testing options for Lyme disease, you can look me up at pursuewellness.us. And I'd love to book a free discovery call with you. Everyone, make it a good day out there. Thank you. Bye, Kris.
Thanks a lot.